Well, Harry, we are moving now into the next few chapters, 17 to 20, and we start off with the famous story of the Transfiguration, and then move into some of Jesus' advice for his disciples. Do you want to set the scene for us? What's going on here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesus is still teaching in Galilee when we start this part of the gospel. But at the end, he moves toward Jerusalem, and so we're gradually getting closer and closer to the climactic scenes of the end. And the tension builds up as we move along, and the expectations of what it means to be a disciple are ratcheted up, I think, as this process moves along. But we begin with this extraordinary moment in chapter 17, which is picked up from the Markan story of the Transfiguration, where something that Matthew has been hinting at all along becomes apparent to the disciples, that Jesus is a really very special kind of person. Right? He's transfigured before them, and his heavenly character is somehow displayed. Exactly how Matthew understood that heavenly character of Jesus is a little unclear, but that he is a heavenly character is clear. We had seen a hint of that back in chapter 11, where the saying about Jesus and the Father, to the Father who revealed to Jesus all that he wanted revealed, etc., and the bidding to come and find rest in him. Jesus appears as a kind of heavenly figure there in the way that he speaks. And here that heavenly dimension, I think, is portrayed narratively. So this kind of sets the stage for what will be an increasingly gritty and earthly story of Jesus engaged with the powers that be on earth. And so I think it's in part setting that stage in a very dramatic way.
Yeah, interesting. So that contrast between the heavenly and the earthly.
Right.
Yeah. So moving into the advice in chapter 18, some of it's fairly radical, right? He says, cut your arm off, gouge your eye out. Are we to take this literally, Harry?
Well, there's the specific advice about what you're to do in cases of temptation. But I like to frame this in terms of what's going on with this little discourse overall. This is the fourth of the big discourse sections in Matthew, and in some ways it's the least of the lot, right? It's not as extensive as some of the others. But it does have a couple of clear thematic foci, and I think those are worth keeping in mind. One is, as it begins, and you can perhaps comment on this in a bit, become like little children. I know you have little children at home, and that would be interesting to hear. So he's talking to his disciples as children, inviting them to accept the message, accept their status of disciples in the way I think that a trusting child would. I think that's an important part of it. And then also a warning. Matthew always has the warnings going on here, right? So if you scandalize one of these children, then it would be better to have a great millstone fastened around your neck and drowned, right? Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. An important bit of advice in this day and age where we've seen too many scandals with children in churches, especially my own. So this leads into the advice that you were talking about in chapter 18, verses 8 and following. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. This is another example, I think, of what we've spoken about before, the hyperbolic statements of Jesus that really challenge you to challenge any hearer to think about where your values truly lie. I don't think Jesus meant this literally. The tradition certainly has not taken it as such, but it has taken it as a serious warning about that very issue. That is, where does your heart beat most strongly? Yeah. And uproot from yourself those things that are not conducive to life and life in abundance, the kind of abundance we saw in the feeding stories. But the rest of this, Matthew always has words of consolation and hope balanced with his words of judgment. And I think the rest of this is in some ways more on the hopeful side, and it's about reconciliation. And so one of the things to take away from this discourse is a little bit of reflection on what was going on in Matthew's church, which is probably not unlike things that have gone on in most churches throughout time. That is, people don't always get together in the best way all the time. And I think Matthew was saying, I know, folks, that that's the case, but it's your responsibility. His emphasis on responsibility and getting the deed done. It's your responsibility to see that that happens, and do so in light of the fact that God is forgiving. And then Peter, of course, asked, well, how often do we do that? You know, there has to be limits, aren't there?
How many times do you do that? Yeah.
There have to be limits on this, Jesus. And Jesus cites this, fantastic number, 70 times 7, which is a number for as many as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So, the discourse here has these provocative elements that I think go back to Jesus himself, and the elements of reconciliation within this community of people who are trying to live by the highest ideals. It's a recognition that quest for perfection that Jesus laid on the table in the Sermon on the Mount is not an easy one.
Right. And I think one of the sort of vivid pictures of this idea of reconciliation that you're drawing out occurs in the parable of the lost sheep, such a famous story. And that parable shows up in Luke as well. Are they using it in the same way? How would you compare the two?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. We know that Jesus uses a lot of agricultural and shepherding images in various places, and those are rooted in the Old Testament as well. So he probably certainly told some sort of story like this. Luke spins it in a different way, and Luke spins it in connection with his concern for forgiveness. And what happens at the end of Luke's story is that there's great rejoicing when the lost sheep is found, as there is rejoicing in heaven when the sinner repents. Here, this is in part of Matthew's warning. It's a warning to leaders in the church that they have a responsibility for the least of their brethren, right? And so it's directed at the shepherds more than at the reaction on the part of the sheep being found. It's saying, shepherds, you look out for those folk who might be going the wrong way.
Yeah. Do you hear, again, that Ezekiel 34 sort of anxiety about the shepherds?
Yeah. Another case of Matthew alluding to and picking up on some important Old Testament themes without the device of an explicit prophetic quotation, which we've also seen him use.
Right, exactly. Another parable in this section is the parable of the unforgiving servant, or the unmerciful servant. What do you make of that? It ties in with this theme of forgiveness that you've mentioned Luke really highlights, but in some ways that are sort of counterintuitive. Help us understand what's happening here.
Well, there are a couple of reward stories and master servant stories that Matthew is using here. And I think that all of them in some way serve as part of the theme that seems to be guiding the composition of this part of the gospel, that there is a cost to discipleship. The figure of the unforgiving servant is in part too about responsibility, about the necessity for action within the framework of an environment where forgiveness and reconciliation is being fostered by a loving God, right? So I think that's part of it all. But the servant who does not act as his master has suggested he should be acting, and as he's given an example of acting, puts the responsibility on the slave. And that's the important message that I think Matthew was trying to get across at this point.
Is it realistic at that time for slaves to be handling large sums of money, or is this just part of the story?
Actually, it sounds to us as a little bit unrealistic, right? We have an image of chattel slavery where slaves were field hands and totally oppressed and everything else. It wasn't pleasant to be a slave generally in antiquity, that's for sure. But slaves had different social roles in antiquity, and some of them could, in fact, be major managers of estates or imperial offices or who knows what. It's not quite as counterintuitive as we might gather from our own experiences of slavery.
Right. And some slaves could have been well-educated as well,
Indeed.
Right? So
yeah, we certainly see this in the Roman imperial house, and we've seen before how Matthew is interested in contemporary structures of authority and wants to critique them in some way or other. But there were a lot of people who were servants of the emperor who were probably as wealthy as anybody else in the Roman Empire. Their status was slave. Their economic resources were enormous.
Yes, right. Well, speaking of structures of authority, we also have the parable in chapter 20 about the laborers, and the master and the laborers and their pay. What's going on with this story? God seems a little bit unfair in this. If
Doesn't
God
he,
is the
though?
master, right?
Right. If God is the master, and that's one of the things about Matthew's version of the parables, the main figure in them is usually taken to be an image of God. And we've said before that there's a kind of shaping of parable interpretation in Matthew, and that's one important part of it. It reflects, by the way, some of the things that go on in rabbinic parables, where very often a king of flesh and blood is a symbol for God. So the main actor in Matthean parables is often a cipher for divinity. Not necessarily so in the way Jesus told the stories to begin with, but certainly here. So the parable of the landowner who has laborers who come in during the course of the day, and the people who come in at 8 o'clock in the morning get the same pay as the people who come in at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which just doesn't seem fair, does it? But some people have pointed out this is probably simply a reaction to market structures. There are fewer laborers around later in the afternoon. You have to pay them more. Yes. I don't think Jesus was trying to give us a lesson in economics. I think both for Jesus and certainly for Matthew, what you have here is an image of graciousness. And people are called to respond in a similar way. But it could be, an issue of the cost of discipleship. And it could be a parable that speaks to the human experience that I think so many of us have had of people saying, well, life just isn't fair. Someone else is getting more than I'm getting. In some ways, Jesus says, if you're going to be a member of this operation, that's going to happen from time to time. Get used to it.
Right. Yeah, the life isn't fair brings me back to what you mentioned in the beginning about my young kids. I hear that quite a bit. But I, at the same time, I think that Jesus' point about having faith like little children is very evident to me as the mother of little children, that they just soak in the world and have this wonder and this faith that is just innate and amazing to see. There's one more thing I've thought about here, Harry, that I'd love to hear your opinion on. So we've talked about Jesus' comment about cutting off your hand, right, in chapter 18. But then in chapter 19, he says this really interesting thing about eunuchs. He says, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Is there a connection between those sayings, and what do you make of this eunuch bit?
Yeah, this is unique to Matthew, this particular saying. And it's in response to a question in chapter 19, verse 10. If such is the case of a man with his wife, is it better not to marry? So it reminds me of the situation in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is talking about marriage and the like. We've already referred to it in connection with the divorce saying, which is also part of this context. And certainly it was the case in some early Christian circles that people thought that it was better not to marry. Paul is addressing that very belief in 1 Corinthians. And we know it becomes important later on as ascetical practice develops in Christianity. And this is often taken to be a text that supports voluntary celibacy in the church, and it probably had a similar kind of function. I think Jesus said something like this. It's not the sort of saying you make up, right? Praising eunuchs. And it's, again, part of the phenomenon we've seen before where Jesus calls into question contemporary family structures. He says that might not be where your commitment ought to be. So I can well imagine Jesus saying this and saying it within the context of an expectation that the kingdom is coming soon, and we ought to be totally devoted to that. But again, probably not encouraging people to go and actually become physically eunuchs. Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen Jesus giving advice to his disciples, and we've seen how some of those sayings are hard. They're difficult sayings, and you mentioned before that this section is ratcheting up the tension and leading us to the controversy that will happen in the climax of the story. That's where we're headed next. Mm-hmm.